As you guys know, I competed in bodybuilding from 2009 to 2013 before completely retiring from competitive bodybuilding to pursue my own personal physique goals. Recently, I stumbled across my old contest prep logs that covered my entire training and diet plan leading into the 2011 contest season. In this video, I'm going to be reacting to my old training logs from 10 years ago, and I'm also going to discuss what I would do differently knowing what I now know. At first glance, reflecting on my age and the lack of bodybuilding training information available at the time, I would say as a 21-year-old natural bodybuilder, I was still way ahead of the curve by using training methods that went completely against the grain back then. Some that even the science-based community haven't supported much until relatively recently, 10 years later. These methods, rooted in some of the very basic old-school bodybuilding principles, built what I would say, as subjectively as possible, as a fairly decent physique, again for my age at the time and training history. But also looking back now on exactly what I was doing, I could say that personally, I would recommend a lot of things be done differently. And I could also argue that my physique would have improved even more had I known then what I learned over the last 10 years and applied it earlier. Let's dive into the training logs and go over exactly what I did and what I would change now. Starting with the training split itself, I followed a 5-day high-frequency routine, training body parts twice per week. This is something I still follow today, and it's my personal favorite setup for a higher frequency approach, just like the one in my 5-day old-school mass game program. I would also extend this out to a 6-day per week routine or a 3-day on, 1-day off repeat routine as I got closer to the contest. These are all things I still agree with to this day, and my stance really hasn't changed much on that. Taking 5 days to train the entire body, hitting each muscle group twice per week, I consider that a great system. But where I failed at the time to really see the full benefits of it was not prioritizing muscle groups that needed extra attention. Looking back at this program, I trained chest and back together twice a week every single week. That was how Arnold did it, the guys in the 70s did it, and they all had the physiques I was trying to emulate. However, as you can see in some of these photos and videos, my chest was decent, but compared to my entire physique as a whole, my back generally lagged behind. Over the years at this time, I was still growing my entire body, but proportionally, my back needed to be brought up compared to the rest of my physique for better symmetry. Being that I also trained chest first on both of my chest and back days, I never really trained my back while completely fresh. And considering at the time I was spending a lot of the sessions chasing a bigger bench press, I'd always go into my back workouts partially fatigued, never getting the most out of any single session. The classic chest and back combo works, but at the very least knowing what I now know, and considering my own personal weaknesses, I would have at least trained back first in either or both of the sessions. Another option would have been to have one heavy back day that I trained all of my pulling movements first while they were fresh, and then finishing that session with chest. Following that up with one chest focus day that I finished off with extra back volume. This would have easily balanced out the intensity and focus, allowing me more equal growth throughout both muscle groups. Or, if I was really looking to bring up my back at a faster rate than any of my other body parts, I would do what I do now and train it on its own day first in the workout and put my larger muscle groups on maintenance training. Over the years, I started experimenting with training back separate from chest and either trained it alone on its own day or paired it with something like arms at the end of the session, which was a muscle group that always grew easily for me. The takeaway from this that I would leave here is there's no one best split for muscle growth. You need to assess where your physique is right now, and if you want to grow, you need to prioritize muscle groups that are lagging. If you're past the beginner and intermediate stage, if you just blindly follow a split routine that wasn't designed for you, you'll eventually end up without a balanced physique, and your strong points will always be your strong points, and your weak points will always lag behind. This is why I also recommend after you've built your base, your training should always be completely customized. Next is training volume. This is another area I think I was ahead of the times, but yet still could have made major improvements. Back then, it was the hard gainer era, where natural bodybuilders were all in fear of doing more than just a few sets per muscle group, or they risked overtraining. I always knew a higher training volume approach worked, and it got me great results. What I didn't understand was that training volume should be waived over time. For example, over the entire 4 to 5 year contest period, I was training each muscle group with generally the same amount of sets. I responded really well by doing only about 6 to 10 working sets of chest twice per week and about 10 to 12 sets of back twice a week. The problem was, it worked well initially, but because I thought I found the sweet spot in terms of training stimulus and recovery, I just relentlessly pounded away each session with the same training volume, trying to force progressive overload by adding weight to the bar, which is another point I want to make after this one, rather than progressively overloading the muscles through increased training volumes. I had always kept strength training landmarks as a reference to my physique. The mindset was, if I squat 315 for 10 reps now, my legs will be bigger when I squat 365 for 10 reps. And while that might be true, I found that when I later started experimenting with higher training volumes, over time, certain body parts were actually growing despite the fact that I was training with the exact same load, but doing more sets per week of that movement. This is one of my biggest arguments against HIIT training, which brings me back to my point about load progression on the bar. Because I was always chasing a rep PR or weight PR every single session, believing in order to progressively overload the muscle, more weight had to be lifted, I was continuously burning myself out and dictating entire training sessions on my performance of one single lift. If I had squats as my first movement on leg day, I'd sometimes spend up to an hour just completing 5 working sets because I was trying the PR on every single set. This took an absurd amount of time for both recovery and focus on each set. And while I may have done all this and got one small victory by hitting 315 for 11 reps as opposed to 315 for 10 reps the previous week, the rest of the session was basically a wash because I only had enough energy to just go through the motions. When I later started purposely leaving reps in the tank in order to hit specific volume targets, I was growing more muscle with more quality sets and reps, which also kept my injury risk much lower. And speaking of injury risk, one of the major issues I have looking back at all of my training programs at this time was there was absolutely no waiving of the intensity or deloads programmed in. I essentially wrote a program out, trained at my max, and then continuously tried to outdo my previous sessions. I did know enough to deload when needed, but at the time, it was never programmed in and was more used as a tool in reaction to my training. If I was beat up or dropping in performance for a few weeks in a row, I'd take a week to deload. What I do now, and a training method that has allowed me to make every single training week productive, is to waive my training intensity along with my volume. At the start of a training cycle, each set is not taken to 100% of its maximum, and the focus is on accumulating the training volume. As the program progresses, I will progressively overload by adding weight, reps, sets, or a combination of all. Then my hardest week of training, which is usually the one that I'll go for real PRs and also push training volumes into the overtraining territory, comes right before a planned deload week. This way I can basically push myself as far as my body can handle and then take the next full week off to recover completely from my hardest training week of the cycle. To summarize all this and what I've really learned over the last 10 years that has helped me improve the quality of my training as well as grow more muscle, these 5 tips are what I'd like to leave you with. First, train most muscle groups at least twice per week for maximum growth. Train your weakest body parts either first in the session or completely on their own on a different day. After you're sure you've learned proper exercise technique, train your weaker body parts with more volume and your stronger muscle groups with less, just to maintain them. Don't chase personal records. Either plan to hit them at the end of a training block or let them happen naturally as a result from proper training volume. Also, focus on using volume as a tool to progressively overload the muscle and not focus only on weight. And finally, plan your deloads into your training programs. They should be done with a purpose and should be programmed in every 4 to 8 weeks depending on your program. If you found any of these tips to be useful in your training, comment down below with your experience. And if you're looking to build your physique using old school bodybuilding training methods, check out my 5-day mass gain program in the description. Or if you're more advanced, work with me directly and get your own custom program below. Alright guys, that's it for the video. If you want to see more of the best original bodybuilding content just like this, make sure to hit subscribe.